Good evening, ladies. Welcome again to our Bible study this evening. And this evening we're getting to the sixth in our series, our short mini-series called In the Arena, the sixth platform, which tonight is called Extinguished Candle Flames. Tonight's platform has many similarities to the current situation that we find ourselves in with this pandemic. And I really pray that the Lord will use tonight's study to establish us, to strengthen us, and to settle all our hearts. In a letter to Amy Carmichael, after he was bereaved of what he calls the darling love of wife and child, Bishop Handley Moule wrote, "I am learning the lesson set to the weaned child. I am learning to do without." This is what tonight's arena or tonight's struggle of the soul is all about. And the imagery comes from Psalm 131. And it speaks about moving towards the maturity that no longer needs outward props for security, but that can be content to depend wholly, completely on the Lord alone. Let's just read that psalm together. Lord, my heart is not haughty or proud, nor my eyes lofty or arrogant. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too profound for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with his mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord, from this time forth and forever. Psalm 131 speaks about a mature, confident, childlike trust that doesn't need outward props for security anymore, but that can be content to depend completely on God alone. To use the words of A.W. Tozer, this platform or this arena tonight is about being brought to the blessedness of possessing nothing. The blessedness of possessing nothing. The way Abraham was. Do you remember how long Abraham waited for his son Isaac? 25 years. And when he was finally born, Abraham's love for his son isn't very hard to understand. This boy represented everything sacred and precious to Abraham. He represented the promises of God and the covenant and the hope of the promised messianic deliverer. But soon, his affection and his love for his son began to border on the perilous cliff of idolatry. It was then that God stepped in with a test, a trial, that would forever cleanse Abraham's love for his son. Do you remember the words of Genesis 22, verse 2? Take your son, Isaac, whom you love, your only son, notice that, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrificing there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. Now, a little bit of sanctified imagination may give us some hint of the tremendous battle that Abraham must have gone through in his heart that night. A.W. Tozer says, it was his trial by fire, and he did not fail in the crucible. While the stars still shone like sharp white points above the tent where the sleeping Isaac lay, and long before the grey dawn had begun to lighten in the east, the old saint had made up his mind. He would offer his son as God had directed him to do, and then trust God to raise him from the dead, as Hebrews tells us. And God, you remember, let him go through with the suffering right up until the point of no return. Just as Abraham was about to kill his son Isaac, he stopped him and gave him back his son. It's okay, Abraham. I never intended that you should kill him. I only wanted to remove him from the temple of your heart so that I can reign unchallenged there. I only wanted to correct the perversion that existed in your love. Now you may have your son back. And so, ladies, God brought Abraham to the place where he possessed nothing anymore. Yes, Abraham was a very rich man and he had everything, but he now possessed nothing. After this bitter and blessed experience, the words my and mine never again had the same meaning for Abraham. His heart had been freed from the possessiveness of things. It is this possessive clinginess to things and to people that this platform, tonight's platform, is all about. You know, we are often hindered from giving up our treasures to the Lord because we're concerned about their safety. And this is especially true when those treasures are our loved ones, our family, and our friends. But we don't really need to have such fears, do we? Our Lord came to save, not to destroy. And everything is safe that we commit to Him. And nothing is really safe, is it, that is not committed to Him. If you want to know God in growing intimacy, if you really want to know Him, if your deepest desire is to pursue intimacy with God, then He will sooner or later bring you into this arena for your good and for His glory. Because as we are reminded again tonight by Isabel Kuhn, the different trials of us Christians are like so many platforms in the world's arena of today. The unbeliever looks on at our struggles, but he is only impressed or influenced if he sees the power of God working there. The purpose of the arena experience, therefore, is not for our punishment, but that God might be revealed, both to us and to a watching world. Remember, we are looking at how the principle of Philippians 3 verse 10 is worked out in practice in our lives. And I hope that you have now been able to memorize these two verses well. Paul says, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death, in order that somehow I might attain to the resurrection of the dead. And tonight's platform is another opportunity to see how the principle of Philippians 3 verse 10, which remember is worked out practically in reverse order, how they are worked out practically in our lives. So let's have a look tonight at platform number 6, which Isabel Kuhn calls Extinguished Candle Flames. She says, the year of 1942 always stands out in my memory as my own personal experience of the horror of great darkness. This is from Abraham's experience in Genesis 15. Life had been swinging along in great joy, and despite the ever-present physical trials of primitive living, remember among the Lisu Christians, the growth of the work and the delightful friendships it developed for us were sunny experiences. But with the year 1942, life turned a sharp corner. And I remind you, 1942 was the middle of World War II in Europe. She was there in China. And I've just lost my place. On the surface, I was flung from pillar to post, she says, emptied from vessel to vessel. But those were only what Bishop Hanley Moule calls the outward woes of our inward pilgrimage. Inwardly, I was set for a much-needed crucifixion of the flesh. But to see the picture properly, the outward woes must come first. So what was happening outwardly? Well, the sinew Japanese War, which lasted from 1937 to 1945, had been going on all these years. But we in the South had felt it only as a distant warning bell. But in 1941, the Japanese entered Burma. Today it's called Myanmar. And before the world's startled gaze, they walked through that small land as with 7-league boots. We were working the mountains of the Hump. Now the Hump is the eastern end of the Himalayan mountains, which are right on the China-Burma border. And you can see something of how the Himalayan mountains come down there and form like a hump that you needed to cross to get into China. And this hump, this range of mountains, the hump, was north of the Burma Road, which you may remember from our first study and which we will see some more of this evening. At the beginning of 1942, we were utterly unconscious that the Japanese would soon be within sight and sound. Generalissimo Chiang, this is General Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader in China at that stage, the nationalist leader, had lost province after province to the Japanese until in 1942 he had only 3 provinces left: Yunnan, Kichao, and Sichuan. Of these 3, our province of Yunnan, with its Burma Road and that airlift over the hump, provided his only route for getting in supplies. If the Japanese got Yunnan, then all of China would be theirs. Now, you need to just understand that at this stage, the Americans had entered the war. You remember after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and they were specifically in the Asia area. And the Americans at this stage were helping the Chinese with supplies and ammunition and things like that in their fight against Japan. And there was a special group called the Flying Tigers, a group of airmen called the Flying Tigers. And there's a picture of some of them on the aeroplane and another one. And these American Flying Tigers were the brave ones who flew over this Himalayan mountain hump in order to bring in supplies for General Chiang Kai-shek. So the point is that if they got Yunnan, if the Japanese managed to capture Yunnan, which was the only way to get supplies into China, then the whole of China would be theirs. She says, now as to my inward pilgrimage, so that was what was happening outwardly. Inwardly, there was an area of my life which the Lord had long needed to discipline. It was the area of the affections. I had always considered that this was one of my strong points, a deeply affectionate nature. But the very intensity of such love has a danger, the danger of selfish possessiveness, clinginess. Intense affection wants to hold on to the loved one and is unconsciously very possessive. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. Galatians 5:42 from the King James Version says. But in another translation, the word lusts is translated as strong desire. And so you could translate it as, they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and strong desires. She says, I knew this truth even before I came to China, but it was mere head knowledge. I didn't know how to recognize it in my own life, let alone how to deal with it. The time had come when I must learn. And so in 1942, there began a systematic stripping away from me of all whom I loved. First, my husband was called to a conference of superintendents in Chongqing. And from then on, events came in such a whirl that we were separated for most of that year. Next, the Chifu School, where Catherine, remember her daughter Catherine, had been left in the China Inland Mission Chifu School, near Shanghai in the northeast of China, close to Japan. Well, this school had been captured by the Japanese, and so her little girl was put into an internment camp together with everyone else and wrapped in silence. Just now and again did a little childish note slip through to us, proof that she was alive and well. Before that, there had been a letter from her every week. Thirdly, Mary Zimmerman, who had acted as our home secretary, duplicating our circular newsletters and forwarding out to us news of and from our friends, fell silent. Her precious mother had been taken home to be with the Lord, and this sorrow was followed by a trial that was so disrupting that Mary couldn't keep up her usual correspondence for about a year. Husband, child, friends, and then my right hand in the Lisu work left us. Now that was for a happy reason, because our boy Lucius got married that year and had set up his own home across the river, and the river being the Selwean River, which was in the canyon, that flowed through the canyon in the mountains where they were working. But nevertheless, the very comfortable prop that he had always been to me was missing. He alone had understood how much it meant to me to have a little corner where I could be private, when I had to live in a Lisu home for 1 or 2 weeks in order to hold a short Bible conference. To the Lisu mind, to be left alone is an affliction. They all sleep in one room, 2 in a bed, and are gregarious by training. They would never dream of so ill-treating a guest as to give her a room to herself. Now, Lucius didn't sympathize with this strange desire of mine, but he had learned that it meant a lot to me, and so when we traveled, in a nice way, he would explain to our hostess Mama's strange liking for privacy. And then, with a merry word here and there, he would himself rig up a screen for me if a room could not be obtained, but behind which I could then retire to wash and sleep. No other Lisu ever took such care of me. Of course, when I traveled with John, he did that. But now I felt stripped of every comfort indeed. And I wasn't so stupid that I saw the stripping was systematic and thorough. Husband, child, friends, and then my right hand in the work. I knew it must be the Lord trying to teach me something. But I was too lonely and heartbroken to submit. Lord, I was made to love and be loved. How can I love without someone that is mine, very specially mine above the rest around me? I'd rather be dead. So moaned the flesh, as it was being set for the crucifixion of its inordinate affections. And with these inner desolations, the outer being was being flung far and wide, as I'm about to relate. The year began happily enough, and I remind you, this is where they were working up there on the border of Yunnan and Burma, in Oak Flat village among the Lisu. The year began happily enough, but then in March, I developed an acute toothache. I tried to pacify it with medicines, but did not succeed, for it was the Lord himself beginning to spill me out of my nest. The nearest competent dentist was in Kunming, which is right on the other side of the Yunnan province. In the old days, it would have meant a 30-day journey, but now with the Burma road open, it could be done in about 2 weeks. But even so, it would require 2 weeks to return, and so I would end up being gone a month or more. The pain soon settled my hesitation, however. I couldn't do any work until that ripping ache stopped. So I called for porters to carry my things and escort me out to Powashan, which is over there. John was at the conference for superintendents in faraway Chongqing, and I thought I could meet him at Kunming, and then we could return together. The plan was very clear to me in my mind. As I was about to leave Oak Flat, I received a pleasant surprise. Lucius appeared, announcing that he was going to escort me out, leading my mule for me over those precipitous and dangerous mountain roads, as had been his old familiar custom. Sorry. He was building his new home for him and Mary, and Parashan was the best place to buy good nails. He would combine his personal business with the fun of escorting me again. To me, this was really a gift from the Lord, because Lucius was a delightful chatterbox, and his witty running gossip of church and village life caused the long hours in the saddle to pass by quickly. Besides this, he was a past master at making Mama comfortable when we camped out at night. We had 4.5 days' journey to go. It used to be 6, but the Burma Road, I just want to remind you where the Burma Road is. The Burma Road had cut it short by that much. March 18th, we set out, so says my diary, traveling about 30 miles and camping out at night in a big airy loft over a large horse stable. We caught a truck at the motor road and so got into Parashan by Saturday, March 21. I'd been dreading this Burma Road trip. There was no regular bus service to the capital city of Kunming, and the only way to go was by Chinese merchant truck. I just want to remind you what the Burma Road looked like and what those Chinese merchant trucks look like. Chinese drivers looking for money regularly overloaded their trucks with merchandise, and passengers were piled on top of that. You had to climb up on top of all the boxes and bundles and bales and perch there, holding on as best you could. And every now and again you came across the wreck of a truck which had gone over, so you knew your fears were not just imagination. The very thought of Burma Road travel in those days still makes one shudder. There is an aerial photograph of the Burma Road, and you can understand why this was such a problem for Isabel. Now, she says, the Lord had an unexpected kindness waiting for me. Now, notice this, because 1942 was the year when he had to give me this much-needed crucifixion experience. And yet, if you watch closely, you will see that he was extra kind whenever it was possible. I was told that 2 of the General Chiang Kai-shek's airmen of the Flying Tigers were driving in a private car to Kunming, and so they could take me with them. Oh boy, no Chinese truck travel. Good American drivers. Wasn't that a kindness? We were to leave at 5:30 in the morning, and so I arose at about 4 o'clock in order to have a quiet time for my devotions. I'd been up early so many mornings and traveling until dark that I debated whether or not to just skip my quiet time for that day and get a little bit more sleep. But that habit of God first, formed in my Moody Institute days, stood me in good stead now. Whatever would I have done in the days ahead if I had missed that particular quiet time? For God had something very particular to say to me. And yet when I lit my lamp at that early hour and turned my sleepy eyes on the portion for the day, Genesis 28, I had the feeling, oh, just the story of Jacob's ladder. Couldn't be anything special in that. Is it the lazy flesh? Or just the devil that puts such thoughts into our heads? I turned my sluggishness over to the Lord and in prayer first, and then as I read that old story, so familiar from childhood, verse 15 sprang out of the page as if I had never read it before. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. The Lord's voice came clear and unmistakable. This is my promise to you for this journey ahead. I thought he meant just the dreaded Burma Road travel, and I was very grateful. And so when Lucius came to rope up my bedding for me, I told him that I'd received a verse from the Lord and roughly translated it. His face lit up and beamed. Praise the Lord! I will bring you back to this land. He's going to bring you back again. I stared at him. Bring me back? Why, of course I intended to come back. Lucius must have missed the point. But oh, how I had to thank the Lord later that it was Lucius who got the point. It was I who nearly missed it. because the full verse reads, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." So I started out on the Burma Road with these two American air pilots, tough but brave, daring men who were not at all thrilled about having this drab-looking, uninteresting missionary woman tagging along with them, but were considerate and kind. Now, ladies, after 4 days of this trip, the car broke down in the middle of nowhere, and so they were stranded there until someone came along in a jeep who offered to pick them up and take them to Kunming. Isabel, when she arrived there, looked forward to the warm, hearty welcome that her sister-in-law, Kay, and her husband, Dave, would give her. They were also missionaries in Kunming. But, she goes on, lonely and feeling ill, I pushed through the gate into the garden, expecting to hear that pleasant yell of welcome as soon as someone spied me. But all was quiet. Questioning, I went into the house and called. My voice echoed dismally, but no one answered. From the back of the house came a patter of small feet, and soon a rosy-cheeked Chinese maiden appeared. "Oh, young Simu," she gave me my Chinese name, but spoke in English to me. "The Harrison family have all moved away into the country for meetings. But come in, I'll take care of you." It was Eva, who had been left in charge of the house. Eva was the oldest daughter of a Chinese pastor who had a large family. She wanted an education, and so she'd come into the Harrison family to help with housework and cooking while she went to high school. She was a little thing in stature and looked only to be about 15, whereas in reality she was 21 years old. People always thought Eva was a child, but she really was a very capable young woman, as I was to learn. Eva was delighted to have company. She'd now graduated from high school, and my Chinese was so rusty that I was very pleased to hear her talk in English, and she, on her part, was perfectly thrilled to get all this English conversation lessons for free, and so English was our medium by mutual consent. She soon had me in the Harrisons' own bedroom and made me a tasty supper, for darkness had already fallen before we reached Kunming. It was March 27th, 1942. I had made it in 9 days from Oak Flat. Very good timing. Now, all those traveling days, my tooth had not ached. Please notice this little kindness of the Lord. But I was feeling ill. I looked ill, and I had dizzy spells. The doctors had quite a time finding out what was wrong with me, but I will explain now so that you'll understand. A tooth which had held a bridge had become abscessed. As the tooth was dead, it didn't ache, and that is why the poison was so hard to discover. I had pains in my head, sometimes in my face, but never in that particular tooth. And yet the poison was going through my system, and I really was ill. By the time the trouble was diagnosed and the tooth pulled, gangrene had set in. Our capable dentist said that if I had come to her 24 hours later, my life would not have been spared. It was more than 2 weeks after I arrived in Kunming that the tooth was discovered, and all of that time I was getting weaker and weaker. Alone in the house, except for Eva, I was too ill to study or to do much but lie in bed, and with plenty of time to brood over my loneliness. All this time, little Eva was a jewel. She would bake the nicest cookies and things to tempt my appetite, and in between meals she would sit beside my bed and chatter away in English. It took my mind off myself, and so I encouraged her and drew her out by questions about her life, studies, friends, and so on. As she answered, I began to get a picture of an unselfish, hard-working young life that amazed me. She was quite unconscious of what she was revealing, for she had worked so hard and she had never had time for self-consciousness. She was a Christian and the soul of honor. As I had continued to get worse, nobody knowing that it was just a tooth, The doctor had wired for John to fly to Kunming. All right. The Chongqing conference, now Chongqing is up there in a different province. The Chongqing conference was over, but John had been contemplating a trip to Lashio, which is in Burma. So reads my diary. He arrived Easter Day, April 5th. By this time, the Harrisons had also returned, and loving care encircled me. But it was 10 more days before they discovered my illness came from the tooth and pulled it, after which my strength returned rapidly. During this time, the Japanese were advancing up Burma. The British were retreating before them, and the Americans were evacuating. The Burmese began to flee into Yunnan. We at Kunming had occasional air raid alarms. Then we heard that the Japanese had taken Lashio, where John would have been if my wire hadn't brought him to Kunming. Unknown to us, the panic of the Burma Road had already begun, and John, as superintendent, felt that he must go west to warn the missionary families in isolated parts to evacuate. None of them had radios, and so they might not know about the danger. He planned to be gone only a few days and then return to me. And by then, everybody was discussing the question of, will Yunnan fall? Just a week later, news came that the Japanese had bombed Paoshan. Now remember, they're in Kunming. Paoshan is over there. They bombed Paoshan on the 4th of May 1942 without warning on a market day, a day when the town was really busy. The carnage was terrible. My diary reports rumors that 15,000 were killed. Survivors stampeded onto the Burma Road in a panic to reach Kunming. And I hope you've had a chance to read through that PDF article that I sent you, which will give you some more interesting historical background to this situation. Somewhere in the midst of this confusion was John. Then on May 9th, John himself arrived, escorting Carl Harrison, who had been at school in Tali, later Partridge, Grace and Eric Cox, and baby Miriam. These latter had barely escaped with their lives. Everybody said that Yunnan would fall. And then followed a series of events in which John was taken off to Tali in order to try and get other workers out. And Isabel, who was, you remember, a Canadian citizen and not yet a naturalized American, came under the British consul and then was ordered to evacuate to Chengdu, which is in a different province in the north. She says the British consul was irritated that I showed reluctance to leave. Everybody is going to have to evacuate, he said, and trucks are going to be at a premium. By staying on now, you will be virtually taking the place on a truck that should be kept for the women and children, even now busy fleeing towards us on the Burma Road. It's selfish for you to stay. What should we do? If only John would return. But John was not my source of guidance. And the Lord was absolutely silent when we prayed for direction. Experience had taught me to stay where I was until the Lord did speak. But the RAF convoy was leaving early on May 17th. And on May 16th, we got word that the Japanese had crossed the Selwyn River on the Burma Road. Still, there was no guidance from the Lord. Stories of Japanese atrocities to women in Hong Kong and Burma began to pour in. The irate British consul sent me word 3 times in that one day, ordering me to go on the next convoy the next morning. What should we do? We decided to go. Early on the morning of May 17th, 1942, we, that is Isabel, her sister-in-law Kay Harrison, with her son Carly and Eva, arrived at the airfield where the convoy was. I forget how many trucks were in the convoy. We had to sit and sleep in the back of the trucks. I remember that underneath me was a spare tire and a typewriter, which in turn were on top of ammunition boxes. We ate RAF rations, RAF the Royal Air Force, British Royal Air Force rations, and we stopped for sleep. Whenever we stopped for sleep, she says the men had to take turns standing watch all night. 7 days and 6 nights of such travel on the Burma Road, and plenty of time to think. Dust and rattle made conversation a burden. Out of sunny Yunnan and into cloudy Kitchal. I'd left my husband behind in Yunnan. But as I lay or sat there hour after hour and day after day, I was thinking, God had not told me to come. What would happen to me? Then I remembered Lucius's beaming face that last morning. Praise the Lord, Mama, he said. He says he's going to bring you back. Genesis 28 verse 15 was becoming a very worn place in my Bible. Well, Lord, I conversed with him on the way. Maybe I'm out of your will in this trip. You didn't tell me to come, but you did let me get pushed into it. And you gave me Genesis 28 verse 15 on that morning. Now I claim the wherever I go, and I claim the promise to bring me back. This land must mean Paoshan. So someday you are going to take me back to Paoshan. Of course, I don't know when, but I have a feeling that the Japanese won't get Yunnan after all. Oh dear, why did I leave? And oh dear, my lonely heart. And I twisted and squirmed with heartache. The afternoon of the 6th day, we pulled into Suyong, and there 2 CIM missionaries were waiting for us. They had a telegram from our headquarters in Chungking saying that their accommodations, as well as those at Chengdu, were full up. And so we were told to get off the convoy at Luxian in Sichuan province. That's over there. And stay with Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Lee until further notice. We arrived there the next afternoon at 4:30 and were cordially welcomed by the Lees. Almost my first question was, has Yunnan fallen? Why no, said Mr. Lee in polite bewilderment. War news seems rather good these last few days. It seems that Generalissimo Chang had sent his crack regiment down a back road, chasing the Japanese back over the Selwyn River and holding them there. Yunnan was saved, and our flight had been perfectly needless. Now here I was, 2 provinces away from Yunnan, with no possibility of getting back. Mr. Lee was very cordial, but one could see that he wondered why we had run so far away. There'd never been any talk of Yunnan falling in their part of the world. I was heartsick. My life seemed one wreck of desolation, and the future bleak. What was happening to my little girl in Japanese hands? Can you imagine her concern over her child as well, that was in an internment camp? Well, Mr. Arnold Lee had word that the school and the children were actually being kindly cared for by their captors. This was also the time during which, you may remember, the Olympic champion Eric Liddell was put into a Japanese internment camp. So she was being kindly cared for, thank the Lord for that. But a matter that made us all look sober was our extreme shortage of funds. Friends at home were giving generously, but the pegged exchange rate gave us only 50% of the true market value, and so all of us were being pinched financially. This made my return to Yunnan all the more hopeless. The RAF convoy had brought us here free of charge, but if I returned, I would have to pay my own way back and suffer all those days and days on a Chinese truck on the Burma Road. My heart fainted at the thought. The only thing to do, counseled Mr. Lee kindly, was to brush up on my Chinese language, settle down and help with the church work at Lucian. Kay Harrison had received a letter from her husband Dave, which made us all feel very bad. Dave felt that those rumors that Yunnan would fall had been the devil's masterstroke. Not only had it scattered us to far Sichuan, but other missionaries had flown out to India and left China entirely. His preaching band had heard the rumors as well, got excited and all run home. We were going to evangelize a part of the country that had been on my heart for years, and I had the best preaching band collected that I've ever had, and now they're all dispersed. Refugees from the Burma Road are still piling in, and we've never had so many opportunities for service and no missionaries, wrote Dave. I hear that John is having a wonderful time in the West as well. It's just heartbreaking that Satan has scored such a victory, he continued. You could imagine how this made me feel, says Isabel. I simply ate my heart out with grief. Even my hair went dead until someone said it looked like straw. My diary for June 4th records that Mr. Lee had a talk with me, suggesting that maybe I could help with the new school at Kiating. This really flattened me. It showed that mission leaders were trying to find a place for me in the province of Sichuan. But my husband was in Yunnan, and my dear Lisu, oh Lord, what should I do? Never had the Lord's presence left me. Frequently he gave me comforting Bible verses assuring me of his love. But I'm a human being, Lord, I wailed. It's a human touch and love that I crave so. And not just anybody's, I want my own. Can you see the tantrum of the child being weaned from the breast? The next day came a letter from John telling of wonderful opportunities he was having. I do so wish you were with me, dear, he wrote. Then I began to question, Lord, may I not go back? I spoke to Mr. Lee about it. He was kind but looked alarmed. You were sent here by the recommendation of the British consul, Isabel, and they are still fighting in Yunnan. I don't see how you can return without the consul's permission, and I'm sure he'll never give it to you now. Besides, there are plenty of trucks still fleeing from Yunnan, but very few returning to it. I don't know how you're going to get transport there. But I was getting more and more desperate. I will bring you back to this land. Lord, you did promise that. Please help me to get back. The next day I wrote to Mr. J.R. Sinton, who was the acting head in place of our general director those days. I told him I felt that I should return to Yunnan and of the opportunities that Dave and John had written about. Then I had to wait for an answer. In the meantime, another letter came from Dave Harrison saying he couldn't see any reason why Isabel couldn't return. And still Mr. Lee was dubious about a woman going alone on a Chinese truck all that long way, and that without consular permission. On June 13th, Mr. Sinton's answer arrived. He advised my waiting until my husband invited me to return. That was enough for me. The next day was Sunday, and I took the morning off for fasting and prayer. It was no small thing to act without consular authority, because I'd decided that it was useless to apply for it. I just had to slip back without telling anyone. But the main thing was the Lord's permission. I didn't doubt that he had promised to take me back to Powhashan, but the point was when? Was it to be now, or should I wait 2 weeks? I went out into a Chinese cemetery, and there among the graves, undisturbed by spectators, I poured out my heart to the Lord. I had 4 difficulties to lay before him. The very first being an utter impossibility. Quite simply, I did not have enough money for that trip. Some gifts had come through, but our account had been very low, and I not only had the expense of getting to Yunnan, I still would have to cross almost the entire province before I reached Lisuland again. And the exchange rate was still impossibly low. So my requests were laid out in this way. Number 1, money to make the trip. Number 2, John's invitation, just to satisfy Mr. Sinton. It would be nice to have you here, might not be recognized as an invitation in headquarters' eyes. Number 3, trucks going to Yunnan. They were very few in those days. And number 4, I dreaded going alone with Chinese men. So, Lord, could I have a companion? Within just a little more than 24 hours, the Lord had answered all 4. Special gifts arrived in the mail. A telegram from John arrived urging me to join him. Mr. Lee found a convoy of 3 merchant trucks going back to Kunming, and Eva asked to go with me. The money was the biggest miracle of all. Years before, John had received a legacy, and learning about a certain young Bible student who didn't have sufficient funds to cover or finish her course, we had given her $100. She'd written to us that if ever she was able after graduation, she would repay us. But we merely laughed at that. We gave it to the Lord and we forgot about it. I had truly forgotten all about that. But the Monday after my prayer day, the mail brought 2 letters from this girl. These letters were written and posted 6 months apart, and yet arrived in the same mail. And each letter contained $50. The marvel of it has never left me. The gift of Eva was just as unbelievable. When the money for my return trip arrived so miraculously, of course I ran in to tell Sister Kay. Eva, sewing in the corner, heard me say that I had money to take me back to Kunming, and shortly after I'd gone back to my own room, Kay appeared at my door. Eva says she would like to go back with you. She says she will go and work for you in Lisuland if you will take her. I haven't got any money to pay for her return expenses, and I'm not going to need her here at Kieting where I'm going. So if you want her and can pay her fare, please take her. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe my ears. To me, Eva was a rare jewel of a helper whom nobody would ever willingly relinquish. I was afraid that Kay might regret it, but she said, no, if you want to take Eva, take her. The very next day, Mr. Lee got us our trucks. The one that we were to ride in was a brand new one, and by paying the truck company a little bit of extra money, we obtained tickets for 2 seats in the cab next to the driver. That meant that we would not have to perch on top of baggage, and that we wouldn't be exposed to the rain or bad weather because it was the rainy season. We were to leave the next morning. I prayed on Sunday, and we left on Wednesday. That's how fast the Lord worked for me. Now on this trip, ladies, they had many adventures along the way. The driver of this truck turned very nasty and began to harass them. Actually, at one isolated spot, this driver got out of his truck and deliberately showed them that he was an immoral man. She says, of course we refused to look, but Eva caught my hand in terror. Don't be afraid, dear, I whispered. The Lord is with us. And in my heart I prayed, Lord, you promised I will watch over you wherever you go. This is one of the all places. This driver eventually wanted to force them onto the back of the truck so that 2 nice young ladies that he had picked up along the way could take their seats. When Isabel refused, because she'd paid extra for those 2 seats, he began to threaten them. She continues, was there ever a blacker moment? No one in Kunming knew that when we were arriving, and so our non-arrival wouldn't alarm our friends there. They might wait a month without concern for us. And I didn't have consular protection either. But there is always one with us who is greater than the governments of this world. Again, desperately in my heart, I cried, Lord, your promise, I will watch. I hadn't got time to finish the verse before a hand plucked my sleeve from behind and a Chinese voice whispered hoarsely, get into my cab, quick, both of you. We whirled around and sprang into the cab of the second truck. The driver shot into place behind the wheel, raced his motor, and off we sped, leaving my driver still swearing and trembling with rage. We were now in a much older truck one that had broken down several times during the trip. But as we sped along into a good lead over the other trucks, our new driver turned to me and said quietly, "Lady, never do that again." All day long, we had kept in the lead and out of sight of the other trucks. And all day I'd prayed that this old truck wouldn't break down again. And it didn't. Another Chinese woman was with us, so that Eva had to sit on my knee or partially on my knee, but our driver was very courteous and drove us right up to the Harrison's door in Kunming. Luckily, our baggage had already been placed on his truck, and we were safe. "I will watch over you." He had watched. He'd never promised that we wouldn't have trials. Dave Harrison gave us a resounding welcome, and soon Eva was back in her old place making us tasty meals. Eva wanted to go with us to Lysuland, and Dave was quite pleased for her to go, because since she had graduated from high school, Eva's mother had been quite angry at her for doing servant's work in the Harrisons' home. Several times she'd made it quite unpleasant for them, and so Dave was very glad that Eva could go with them. Then the Lord worked for us. A friend's ambulance unit, a British ambulance unit, was driving to Tali. They're in Kunming, there's Tali, and they offered to take Eva and me with them. Oh, how grateful I was that I didn't need to travel that stretch of the Burma Road on a Chinese truck. It was still the rainy season and we needed cover. We left Kunming on July 15th, and on July 17th, 1942, we pulled into Tali. I was longing to meet my husband. He'd been writing to me from Tali, and so I was all set to meet my dear husband, whom I hadn't seen for more than 2 months. Imagine the shock I felt on arrival in Tali to be told that John had gone out to Paulshan with Dr. May and the medical unit. I was simply shattered. "You'll never have anyone to love you," mocked Satan, taking advantage of my self-pity. God is a jealous God. He doesn't want you to have anyone but Him to love you. It's very devastating to lend your ear to the evil one. If only we could learn that he never tells the truth. Not the whole truth, a half-truth he tells, which is ever the worst of lies. God was loosening my hold on human love. He was nailing my affections to the cross. But not that my life should be without love and loved ones, merely that the inordinate affections should become ordered and controlled. The human props on which I leaned so heavily were bound to give way sometime or other because they were human. And then when they gave way, how painfully I sprawled. If I could only learn to receive my loved ones and yet not lean so heavily on them, hold them and yet not be so dependent on them. It was love, tender, anxious love that was disciplining me, and I was learning, although with such agony. Eva, for instance, was always watching to help me, but already I was alerted to the danger that this could become. "Watch out that she doesn't become indispensable to you," was the Lord's tender warning in my ear. "If you clutch her to your heart and she becomes as indispensable as these others, you'll have all of this pain to go through again, because human props will always fail sometime or other. Lean more on me, my dear. I will never fail or forsake you." And so in loving Eva, there was now a harnessed affection. Always I reminded myself to live in the light of the day when I might have to give her up. But I was slow to learn. The day after arrival in Tali, my diary reads, "At noon I got a letter from John. He's not coming back until August." I felt so heartbroken. But then I received a letter from Girlie, from her daughter. The first one in over 7 months. This happy letter reminded me that Roxy Fraser, the dear wife of our late superintendent, remember J.O. Fraser, would mother my little girl in that internment camp, which she did. And all of this time in Tali, the Lord was working for me so that I wouldn't be tried above what I was able to bear. See, the Lord was looking after her daughter for her, while all of this other turmoil was going on, so that it wouldn't be an extra burden on her, which might break her. I inquired about Eva and myself proceeding to Paulshan, but found a new difficulty. Tali was the last civilian post. All west of Tali was now in the military zone, for the Japanese were still within the province. They were on the west bank of the Selwyn River, and the Selwyn Canyon, which is Lisu land, was now the front line of battle. No one could go west of Tali without a military pass. Even American soldiers were not allowed as far as the Selwyn. Paulshan was only 1 day's journey from the Selwyn. John had gone through because he was attached to Dr. May's medical unit, which was Chinese. If American soldiers were not allowed to go to the Selwyn, then how could I, a woman, ever be able to get there? Now please ponder that. Against that, put God's Genesis 28 verse 15, and will bring you back to this land. Oh, how I clung to that, and how I claimed it in His presence. 10 days the Lord kept me praying and claiming that verse. Now watch how wondrously He worked. John kept writing to me, urging that Eva and I join him in Paulshan. He seemed to forget that we couldn't leave Tali without a military pass. At length I decided to go to the residence of General Song, who was then the head in command of the Western Union Front, and to ask him for a pass to Paulshan for Eva and me. His soldiers looked me up and down without much respect, kept me waiting a long time, and then sent me home without a pass. I learned later that they hadn't even sent in my application. This is what happened when I tried to move in my own strength. But see what happens when God moves. That very evening, an officer arrived at our CIM compound to inform Mrs. Kung that General Song had telephoned to Paulshan and requested that John Kun come to Tali, the general providing transportation. The reason for this wasn't divulged at that time, but I was told to expect my husband soon. The reason, unknown to me then, was this. The general needed someone who spoke Lisu to be able to negotiate with the Lisu, some of whom had received and helped the Japanese. John arrived at Tali on August the 4th, and what a reunion it was. General Song told us that he would give us a military escort right to Oak Flat village. And John was to be made advisor to the nationalist guerrilla colonel in charge of the Piedma Pass, which is the border of Yunnan and Burma, where their Oak Flat church was. And this is what the pass looks like today. In those days, it was just a little mud road. We were to leave in a few days. It was like a dream. Not only a military pass to a point which might at any moment become the front line of battle, but an escort too, and all expenses paid. Only God could do that. And I will bring you back to this land. And so the Lord fulfilled His promise and brought me back again into that land. Now from Paulshan, they traveled by horse over the mountains into the Selwyn Canyon. And she says, and now I was to be home tomorrow. By nature, I disliked travel and change. And here I'd been tossed from pillar to post for 6 long, weary months. I could hardly wait to get home, to my quiet bedroom by the side of the deep ravine, where the birds sang in the morning, and the great peaks glowed back their sunset hues with a steady unshakableness at day's end. I longed to get my roots down comfortably into familiar places. And this, my last little candle flame, had to be blown out. I had forgotten that some missionaries had refugeed to our home from Paoshan after the bombings, and that they must necessarily have changed things. With 5 workers in the house where John and I were only 2, and with 3 of them seriously ill, the furniture had to be changed around. Outside, my home looked as usual, but inside nothing seemed to be as I had left it, and I felt a stranger under my own roof. It seemed as if my last little candle flame of human love had been extinguished. The superintendency had taken my husband. No matter where we lived, he was going to be gone from home for much of the time. War had taken my little girl. Marriage had taken my Lisu helper, and now home was no longer home. My roots couldn't sink down and be comfortable. This seemed to be the last straw that broke the camel's back. To my utter shame, my inner feelings were revealed to those dear guests, and I had to apologize and ask for their forgiveness. They did forgive me, but I saw what was still inside myself, and I was horrified. The sun went down in clouds. The moon was darkened by a misty doubt. The stars of heaven were dimmed by earthly fears, and all my little candle flames burned out. But while I sat in shadow, wrapped in night, the face of Christ made all the darkness light. And now, she says, lest you think my dear master was too hard on me, I want to point out some things. The difficult lessons of 1942 taught me to fear leaning heavily on human props. I had surrendered husband and child and friends and all I possessed long ago, but this was something deeper. This was relinquishing my rights to them. This was holding them, but on the open palm of my hand. Alice McFarlane, principal of our language school in Yangzhou, and a dear warrior saint, had taught me that metaphor. She said, keep your treasures on the open palm of your hand. If you hold something tight clenched in your fist, God may have to hurt you in order to open your fingers and take it from you. But if it is offered on the open palm of your hand, you will hardly know when it is gone. I've never found it so easy that I did not feel when my treasures were taken. But it did make a tremendous difference. It prevented me from collapsing or sprawling. So in 1942, all my little candle flames burned out. It doesn't mean that after such an experience all affection is gone. Just the opposite is true. But affection in its natural state is dealt with. Affection, especially with intense natures as it comes to us from Adam, runs to excess if it is given free rein. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires. Galatians 5:24. Uncrucified love runs into inordinate affection and selfish possessiveness, clinginess, which blights rather than blesses. When we allow the Lord to nail our affections to the cross, to use the scriptural metaphor, we don't stop loving, we love even more widely, but it is a love stripped of corrupting influences. Love isn't killed, only the seed of corruption in natural affection is killed. To go back to the practical illustration, when the little candle flames of human joy were allowed to burn out in Isabel's life, it hurt. And so when God presented her with a new one, when he gave her Eva, she was immediately on guard. Natural affection would have prompted me to embrace her so that we became all in all to one another, but crucified affection caused me to love her, but to always be on the alert that it would not become inordinate affection. Never to let her become indispensable, so that when the human prop is removed, there's a painful sprawl. Never to let home become so indispensable that at his call, I couldn't give it up. This, she says, brought me into a realm of unexpected freedom and relaxation. Human loves did not cease to delight, but they no longer enslaved. Now, I don't want to profess that from the year 1942 on, I never again defaulted in this matter of enslaving infections. I defaulted often enough to keep me humble and totally cast upon the Lord. I can't even sustain the lesson I learned without his help. My own strength is entirely untrustworthy. But through the experiences of 1942, I received a wholesome fear of what disobedience would do to me. And that fear helped me to keep looking to him. Crucified affections lift you into a realm of childlike simplicity and relaxation. Childlike, but not baby-like or immature. You become that weaned child of Psalm 131. The little child takes each day just as it comes. He doesn't waste time imagining tomorrow's woes. He lives one day at a time. If today has tears, they are shed and spent, but they're not carried over into tomorrow. In the days that were to be ahead of me, I would again have partings and separations from loved ones that cost heart agony for some hours, but never again, she says, did they overwhelm me. In other words, all the suffering when my little candle flames went out one by one were worth the tears they cost, because they purchased for me a permanent freedom from sprawling spiritually, from being knocked down and overwhelmed. In other words, it was a kind Lord and not a vicious one who blew out my candles systematically one by one. He had something better for me than earthly candles. But while I sat in shadow, wrapped in night, the face of Christ made all the darkness light. As I look back on 1942, the disappointments and heartaches are a dark blur. That which stands out was the unfailing faithfulness of the Lord. When I was kicking against the pricks, he was never impatient and never withdrew his love. And every time I cried out to him to fulfill the promise of Genesis 28:15, he responded immediately. The power of his resurrection, that's what stands out most sharply. And the dearness of himself, that I may know him. And now, just see what he was lovingly planning to give me as soon as my Job experience had borne fruit in my life. He didn't even wait for that fruition. He gave me Eva as a foretaste and a wonderful reception back to Lisuland from our dear spiritual children. And I couldn't even imagine that in 1 year's time, a little baby son with red gold hair and snow white skin would be cuddled in my arms. It was beyond thought that our home would then be moved from Oak Flat and would be put down right beside Lucius and Mary in the village of Olives. And yet, that's what happened. And there I had not only Lucius and Mary, but Eva and my own little Danny as well. These plans of my dear Lord were all piled up waiting for me just around the corner of the future. And he who was so lovingly dear to me will be the same to you. Yes, he will. An empty tomb always concludes Golgotha's sorrow. But if we want to know the blessedness that follows such a Calvary experience, ladies, we will have to live through them and learn from them to surrender all of our treasures, to hold them on the open palm of our hands. All of our gifts, all of our talents, all of our people that we love, all of our things. Can he trust you to pass through such an unexplained discipline without fear of being misunderstood and without needing to explain? As Bishop Frank Houghton said after the death of his sister, many of our friends in their letters of sympathy speak of God's mysterious ways. And I know there is an element of mystery, but I shrink from the suggestion that our Father has done anything that needs to be explained. What He has done is best, just because He has done it. And I pray that as a family we may not cast around for explanations of the mystery, but rather exult in the Holy Spirit and say, I thank Thee, Father, even so, Father. It suggests a lack of confidence in Him if we find it necessary to try and understand everything He does. Will it not bring Him greater joy to tell Him that we need no explanation because we know Him? But I doubt not that there will be a fulfillment of John 12:24. Very truly I tell you that unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. In John 13 verse 7, Jesus said, you don't realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. Can you thank me, says Jesus, in those words spoken to Helen Rosevear so long ago? Can you thank me for trusting you with this, even if I never tell you why? I lay my whys before your cross, in worship kneeling, my mind too numb for thought, my heart beyond all feeling, and worshiping, realize that I, in knowing you, don't need a why. Let's pray. Lord, I want to know you, but my cowardly heart fears to give up its treasures. I cannot part with them without inward bleeding, and I don't hide from you the terror that such a parting causes. I come trembling, but I do come. Lord, please root from my heart all those things that I've treasured so long and that have become a very part of my living self, so that you may dwell there without a rival. And then my heart will be your temple, and there will be no need for the sun to shine in it, for you yourself will be the light of it, and there shall be no night there. All my candle flames go out, but the face of Christ will make the darkness light. May that be true, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.